I stood on Owen Hargrove's porch on a raw October morning with a basket of eggs balanced on one hip and my pride balanced considerably less steadily on the other, and I told him plainly, before he could say a word, that I had no cash money to offer him for mending my barn, only eggs, preserves, and 2 working hands willing to earn out whatever the labor was worth. I had rehearsed that sentence the whole 3 miles from my place to his, certain I would need every ounce of it to keep from being turned away before I finished speaking, walking the whole distance over frost-hardened ruts with the basket handle cutting into my forearm and my breath showing pale in the early morning cold, because I had already been turned away twice that week, with men with less skill and considerably less patience than Owen Hargrove was reputed to have. I remember practicing the words under my breath more than once along that walk, adjusting the phrasing each time, worried too much apology in my tone would invite pity and too little would invite a closed door, and arriving at his gate no more certain which balance I had actually struck than when I had set out. If that barn was not standing sound before the first real snow, I stood to lose the milk cow, the 2 mules, and whatever hay I had managed to put up that autumn, all of it exposed to a Montana winter with nothing but a half-collapsed roof and 3 walls leaning at angles no honest carpenter would call safe. The storm that took it had come through in September, a wind fierce enough to peel back half the shingles and snap the main support beam clean in 2, arriving in the middle of the night with a roar that had woken me from a sound sleep, certain the whole house was coming down around me, only to step outside at first light and find the barn instead reduced to a wreck of splintered timber and torn tin roofing scattered halfway across the near pasture. I had spent the 2 weeks since going door to door across the county with an offer no cash-strapped widow should have had to make twice, let alone 6 times over, watching man after man decline as politely or impolitely as their manners allowed, some citing their own busy season, others simply saying, with a bluntness that stung more than it should have, that barter was a fine thing between equals, but a poor substitute for coin when a man had his own family's needs to consider first. Owen did not decline. He did not even hesitate the way I had braced myself for him to hesitate, weighing the offer the way most men weighed anything that did not involve coin changing hands. He looked at the basket of eggs, then at me, taking his time about it in a way that made my face go warm despite the cold morning, his gray eyes moving over my face with an attentiveness I had not felt directed at me in a very long time. And he laughed, a short, surprised bark of a laugh that I initially mistook for mockery until I saw his face and understood it was something else entirely, something closer to genuine amusement at his own expense rather than mine. He told me I had already paid him more than money ever could, simply by walking 3 miles to make the offer honestly, instead of riding into town to beg credit off a merchant who would only use the debt against me later, and that he would start on the barn the following morning if that suited me. I stood there on his porch for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, uncertain whether I had just been complimented or gently mocked, and settled, eventually, on believing it was the former, mostly because his eyes had not left mine once through the entire exchange, and because something in his tone had carried none of the careful performance I had grown so used to hearing from Cyrus Bellamy. I should tell you plainly why that particular observation of his landed as hard as it did, because a stranger's offhand remark does not usually cut a person to the quick unless it happens to land on an old wound already sitting close to the surface. Cyrus Bellamy, the most prosperous merchant in our county seat, had been calling on me with increasing frequency since the harvest came in short, each visit dressed up as neighborly concern, and each one, underneath the fine manners, an offer of marriage framed as simple arithmetic. His capital and standing set plainly against my empty larder and failing barn, presented as though love and dignity were luxuries a sensible widow could no longer afford to indulge. He always arrived on Sunday, always in the same fine gray suit, always bearing some small gift meant to demonstrate his means: a tin of good tea, a length of ribbon, once even a small sack of white sugar that must have cost him more than my whole week's egg money. And each gift landed, whether he intended it to or not, less like a courtesy and more like a small, precise reminder of exactly how thin the margin was between my current circumstances and outright ruin. I had not yet said yes to him. I had also not yet found the nerve to say no in any way that would actually stick. And Owen's easy dismissal of money as the only honest measure of a person's worth felt, that morning, like the first crack of light through a door I had not realized I was standing pressed against. My husband Jacob had died 2 winters before this story begins, taken by a lung fever that settled into his chest during a hard January and never fully released its hold, leaving me the farm, 40 acres of decent bottomland, and considerably more debt than either of us had ever discussed openly while he lived. He had been a laughing, easy man, the sort who made even hard chores feel companionable rather than grim, whistling old church hymns off-key while he mucked out the stalls, and inventing small games out of the most tedious tasks just to keep us both laughing through them. And his absence had left the farm feeling less like a home and more like a task list I performed alone every single day, without anyone to laugh through the harder parts of it with me. I remembered, that October morning walking to Owen's place, how Jacob would have handled the barn's collapse, with a string of creative curses followed almost immediately by some half-mad scheme for rebuilding it twice as good, and how much I missed, even now, having someone to share that particular mixture of disaster and dark humor with. I had managed 2 years on my own through sheer stubborn effort, refusing every offer of pity the town extended, and most of the practical help besides, mending fence with my own 2 hands even when the wire cut them raw, learning to slaughter and dress a hog myself the second winter after watching old Constance do it the first, until the storm took the one structure I could not repair through stubbornness alone. Owen arrived the next morning as promised, before the sun had properly cleared the eastern ridge, with a wagon full of salvaged lumber and a hired hand named Silas trailing behind him on a mule, both men already dusted with frost from the early ride, and neither complaining a word about it. He worked the way he spoke, without wasted motion or unnecessary conversation, measuring twice and cutting once, checking every joint with a level even when it plainly did not need checking, the kind of careful, unhurried competence that told me more about the man than any amount of conversation could have. I found myself, over that first week, watching him from the kitchen window more often than I strictly needed to for any practical purpose related to the barn's progress, telling myself each time that I was simply checking on the work's pace, though I suspect even then some honest part of me knew better. He took his midday meal at my table each day as agreed, and though our conversation rarely stretched beyond the weather and the work those first several days, I noticed him noticing things about the farm that Jacob's own family had never once commented on in 2 years of half-hearted visits. The careful mending in the fence line I had done myself, the extra care I put into the hen house, the small graft I had attempted on the old apple tree that had not quite taken, but showed I understood the principle well enough to try. He asked about the graft directly on the 4th or 5th day, wanting to know which rootstock I had used and whether I considered a different splice, kneeling right there in the cold mud to examine the union more closely. And I remember being almost startled by the plain, genuine curiosity in the question, unused as I had become to anyone asking after my small private projects rather than simply my needs. Jacob had never much cared for the orchard side of the farm, leaving it entirely to my own devices, and I had half forgotten what it felt like to have someone take an interest in a piece of work purely because it interested them rather than because it needed doing. The dark turn in this particular story arrived not from the barn work at all, which proceeded steadily and without incident through most of October, but from Cyrus Bellamy, who had apparently heard through the county's efficient grapevine that a rancher was spending his days at my farm, and had decided in his own careful merchant's way that the arrangement required correcting before it went any further. He called on me on a Sunday afternoon while Owen and Silas were away at another job, dressed in his finest gray suit despite the mud on my dooryard, his boots so poorly suited to the conditions that he had to pick his way across the yard with a fastidiousness that would have made me smile under different circumstances, and informed me, with the same patient condescension he always used, that a widow trading farm goods for a strange man's daily company was inviting exactly the kind of talk that would leave me with neither reputation nor prospects come spring, and that his own offer, unlike Owen Hargrove's temporary labor, represented a permanent and respectable solution to problems that barter alone could never actually solve. I noticed, watching him settle uninvited into my one good chair, how carefully he arranged his coattails first, a small vanity I had seen him perform at church suppers and town meetings alike, as though even sitting down required a kind of public presentation. He laid out his case the way he must have laid out inventory ledgers in his store, methodical and unhurried, ticking points off on his fingers as though I were a customer weighing two comparable goods, rather than a woman weighing the entire remaining shape of her life, mentioning the size of his house in town, the standing of his family, the schooling any children we might have could expect, each point delivered with the flat confidence of a man reciting figures he had long since memorized. And when he finished, he sat back in my one good chair and waited, with visible confidence, for me to see the sense of it the way he plainly believed any reasonable person eventually would. I did not have a ready answer for him that afternoon, and I want to be honest about that, rather than pretend I met his condescension with immediate, satisfying defiance. 2 years of scraping by alone had worn down more of my resolve than I liked to admit, and some small, tired part of me heard his offer of permanent security and felt, for one uncomfortable evening, genuinely tempted to simply stop fighting and accept the arithmetic he presented as inevitable. I sat up long past midnight that night at my own kitchen table, staring at the ledger of debts Jacob had left me, doing the same hard sums over and over by the light of a single guttering candle, trying to make the numbers say something other than what they plainly said. And I did not arrive at any comfortable answer before exhaustion finally took me to bed. I remember, at some point in those long, dark hours, catching my own reflection faintly in the black kitchen window and hardly recognizing the tired, uncertain woman looking back at me, so unlike the person I had believed myself to be through 2 years of stubborn, solitary survival. Constance, my nearest neighbor and the only widow in the county who had weathered longer alone than I had, came by the following morning before I had even finished my coffee, having heard through the same efficient grapevine that Bellamy had called on me the day before, arriving with a jar of her own gooseberry preserves, and an expression that told me plainly she already knew exactly what had transpired, her sharp blue eyes taking in my tired face before she had even set the jar down on the table. She sat across my table with the particular bluntness only a woman twice my age and twice my losses could manage, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup, and told me plainly that she had buried 2 husbands herself, one for love and one for arithmetic exactly like Bellamy was proposing, and that the arithmetic marriage had been, without question or close competition, the loneliest decade of her entire life, emptier even than widowhood itself, because at least widowhood did not require her to perform affection she did not feel for a man who had purchased her the same way he purchased grain futures. She told me, too, about small humiliations she had never shared with anyone else in the county, how her second husband had kept a careful private accounting of every dress and bonnet he purchased her, presenting it to her once a year, not as a gift, but as a kind of tally, proof of his generosity that doubled, in practice, as a quiet reminder of exactly how thoroughly she belonged to him. I sat with that story a long while after she left, turning it over the way I had turned over Bellamy's numbers the night before, and found it weighed considerably heavier in the final accounting. I told Owen about Bellamy's visit 3 days later, not because I intended to, but because he asked, directly and without any of Bellamy's careful diplomatic phrasing, why I had seemed distracted and short-tempered all that week, catching me off guard at the woodpile where I had been splitting kindling with considerably more force than the task required. I found I did not have it in me to deflect a question asked that plainly, not from a man who had spent 2 weeks proving, through steady, unglamorous work rather than fine words, exactly the sort of plain dealing Bellamy only performed. He listened without interrupting, the way he did most things, setting down his own axe and leaning against the woodpile while I talked through the whole uncomfortable visit. And when I finished, he set down the length of fence wire he had been coiling and said, after a long pause, that he had no standing to tell me who I ought to marry, but that he had known Cyrus Bellamy for 11 years and had never once in that entire span seen the man extend a kindness that did not eventually come with an invoice attached, whether the invoice was written on paper or simply collected later in the currency of obligation and control. He told me a story of his own, briefly, about a barn raising some years back, where Bellamy had loaned lumber to a struggling family, and then, when the debt went unpaid through no real fault of the family's own, had quietly bought up the note from the original lumber supplier and used it, over the following winter, to pressure the family into selling him their best grazing acreage at a fraction of its worth. Owen said he had helped that same family move their remaining stock the following spring, watching the husband, a proud man not unlike myself in temperament, struggle to hold his composure in front of his own children as they packed the last of their belongings onto a borrowed wagon, and that the memory of it had never fully left him, resurfacing now, he said, with a clarity that told me exactly how seriously he had taken my situation from the very first mention of Bellamy's name. I asked him, somewhat sharper than I intended, what exactly he thought his own daily presence on my farm was, if not a kindness that might someday come with its own invoice attached. And he did not flinch from the question the way I half expected him to, only considered it seriously for a moment the way he considered most things, turning the coil of fence wire over once in his hands before answering, the late afternoon light catching the gray already threading through his dark auburn hair in a way I found myself noticing more than I strictly needed to. He said the honest truth was that he had stopped counting the debts somewhere around the second week, once he understood that what I was actually offering him in trade was not eggs and preserves at all, though he was perfectly happy to keep eating both, but the plain, increasingly rare experience of a person who said exactly what she meant and meant exactly what she said, a quality he had gone hunting for his whole adult life without much luck, until a woman showed up on his porch with a basket of eggs and an uncomfortably honest proposition. He added, almost as an afterthought, glancing away toward the half-repaired roofline as though the admission cost him something to make directly, that he had also simply enjoyed the work more than he cared to admit, and the company more than that, and that if I wanted a precise accounting of which motive weighed heavier, he did not think he could give me one honestly, because the two had become, by that point, nearly impossible to separate. He said, too, that Silas had noticed it before he had, teasing him more than once about riding out to my place before the sun was fully up on days when the barn work genuinely could have waited, and that he had finally stopped bothering to deny it once the teasing became a running joke between the two of them. I should tell you now what I had not told anyone in the county, not Constance, not even in my own private accounting of the situation, which is that Owen Hargrove had not always been the solitary, careful man the county now knew him as. He told me himself one cold evening in early November, while we sat on my porch after the day's work was done, wrapped in the same old quilt I used to keep off the porch chill, our shoulders close enough that I could feel the warmth of him even through 2 layers of wool, that he had gone into partnership with a childhood friend 8 years earlier to expand his herd, trusting the man's word on a handshake the way his own father had taught him to trust a neighbor's word, only to discover 18 months later that his partner had quietly mortgaged half their joint stock against debts of his own, leaving Owen to either absorb the loss himself or watch the whole operation collapse. He described the specific moment he learned of it, standing in the county recorder's office, looking at a filing he had never signed and had never even known existed. A clerk sliding the document across the counter with the same bored indifference he likely gave every other transaction that crossed his desk that week. The particular sick lurch of discovering that 8 years of trust had been resting, without his knowledge, on nothing sturdier than a friend's private desperation. He said he had ridden home that day, not sure whether he was more furious at his former partner or at himself, for having been the sort of man who never thought to ask for anything in writing between two people he had known since boyhood, and that the lesson had cost him considerably more than the herd itself ever could have. A lesson he said he had carried carefully, almost too carefully, into every dealing he had made since, until a woman with a basket of eggs had made him wonder, for the first time in 6 years, whether he had perhaps overcorrected. He had absorbed it, rebuilding alone over 6 hard years, selling off half his own land to cover what remained of the debt, and starting the herd again nearly from scratch, and in the process had developed a wariness around any arrangement dressed up in more paperwork than plain speech, a wariness that had kept him solitary far longer than he had originally intended. He said he had turned down 2 respectable courtships in the years since, both women perfectly kind and perfectly sensible, simply because he could no longer tell the difference, in his own mind, between genuine affection and careful arithmetic dressed up to look like it, and that he had half resigned himself, by the time I showed up on his porch with a basket of eggs, to simply staying solitary rather than risk being made a fool of a second time by trust extended too easily. What followed, over the remaining weeks of barn work, was a slower unfolding than either of us, I think, expected going into it. Owen finished the main structure by the middle of November, working through weather that would have sent a less determined man home twice over. Sleet turning the yard to mud more than once, and his hands going raw and split from the cold, despite his gloves. And I found myself, some evenings, inventing small excuses to keep him at supper past the point the work strictly required, offering a second cup of coffee or a slice of pie I had not strictly needed to bake that day, watching him grow easier in his manner the longer he stayed, the wry humor I had noticed only in flashes those first weeks becoming a steadier, more constant presence at my table. Silas took to teasing him gently about it, once in my hearing, remarking that Owen had never in 8 years of working together lingered past a job's natural finish, and Owen had only shrugged and said something about the coffee being better here than anywhere else in the county, which Silas and I both understood, without either of us saying so, to be only part of the actual reason. I caught Silas grinning to himself over his own coffee cup more than once after that, saying nothing further, but plainly enjoying whatever private wager he and the other hands must have had running about how long it would take Owen to admit the truth out loud. Bellamy made one final attempt in late November, calling on me again with an offer sweetened by an additional acre of town lots he claimed would secure my future beyond any question, arriving this time with a small leather folio of papers already drawn up, as though the outcome of the conversation had never been in genuine doubt in his own mind. He sat in my one good chair once more, laying the papers across my table with the same methodical, unhurried confidence as before, and I found, standing on my own porch listening to him list the practical virtues of his proposal, watching his soft, uncalloused hands smooth the pages flat, that I had finally found the plain words Constance and 2 years of hard-won independence had been quietly preparing me to say. I told him that I had weighed his offer honestly, the way I weighed any honest offer, and that I had found it wanting not in its arithmetic, which was sound enough by his own measure, but in the plain fact that I did not intend to spend whatever years I had left performing a marriage the way I might perform a business transaction, however secure the terms. He did not take the refusal well, his composure slipping just enough for me to glimpse, briefly, the irritation beneath the careful manners, a tightness around his mouth that no amount of practiced courtesy could quite smooth over, before he gathered his papers back into the folio and told me, with a coldness considerably less polished than his usual courtesy, that he hoped I would not come to regret my own sentimentality when the harder years arrived, as he was quite certain they would. I watched him climb back into his fine buggy with rather less grace than he had climbed out of it, and felt, watching him go, not triumph exactly, but a kind of settled relief, the particular relief of a decision finally made honestly rather than merely delayed. Owen finished the barn on the last day of November. The same week the first real snow finally arrived, the new timbers still pale and unweathered against the older gray wood of the walls that had survived the storm. And I remember standing beside him in the cold, looking at the finished structure, feeling a satisfaction that had less to do with the barn itself and considerably more with everything the 2 months of building it had quietly built alongside it. Silas had already ridden off toward home, leaving the two of us alone in the fading afternoon light with our breath showing and the first fat snowflakes just beginning to drift down around us. He did not say anything grand or rehearsed that afternoon, only stood beside me looking at the same walls I was looking at, hands in his coat pockets, and after a while he said, in that same dry, unhurried way of his, that he supposed the debt between us was finally settled, and that he found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, not particularly eager for the settling of it to mean he had any reason left to keep coming around. I told him plainly, because plain speech had become, somewhere over those 2 months, the only language either of us seemed to trust completely, standing there in the softly falling snow with my hands going cold and not caring in the slightest, that I had never once considered the barn the actual point of the arrangement, and that if he was asking whether he still had a reason to keep coming around, the answer had probably been forming in me since somewhere around the 2nd week, when he first noticed the graft on my apple tree and asked, with genuine curiosity rather than polite indulgence, whether I thought it might still take. He smiled at that, the first truly unguarded smile I had seen on him in the full 2 months I had known him, the expression transforming his whole weathered face in a way that made him look, briefly, a decade younger, and said that he had wondered, more than once, whether I had noticed him noticing things, and that he had been rather hoping I had, without quite finding the nerve to ask outright. He told me the following spring, standing beside that same apple tree which had, against both our expectations, finally begun to bud, small tight green knots swelling along branches I had nearly given up on the previous autumn, that he did not have much of a proposal prepared, being a man more comfortable with fence wire than fine words, but that he would like to formalize an arrangement neither of us had ever properly named, on the understanding that whatever he brought to it going forward would never again be measured against what I had first offered him in eggs and honest labor, because he had long since stopped keeping that particular ledger. I laughed at that, more from relief than any real amusement, and told him that if he was determined to stop keeping ledgers altogether, he would need to find some other man to help him with the ranch's actual bookkeeping, because I certainly did not intend to let a fine sentiment interfere with an honest accounting of livestock and feed, a small joke that nonetheless carried, underneath it, my genuine and considered answer. He laughed too, properly this time, the sound of it startling a pair of crows out of the very apple tree we were standing beneath, and said that he supposed a woman who insisted on keeping her ledgers straight even in the middle of a proposal was exactly the sort of woman he had been hoping to find all along. Cyrus Bellamy married a banker's daughter from the county seat the following autumn, a match the town agreed suited his particular arithmetic considerably better than mine ever would have. The union celebrated with the sort of lavish reception his own means could easily afford, and mine, even at their best, never could have. I heard, second-hand through Constance, that he seemed content enough with the bargain, which I found I could wish him honestly, having finally understood that his kind of contentment and mine had simply never been measuring the same thing, and that there was no particular cruelty in two people wanting different shapes of a life, only in pretending, as he had once tried to convince me, that only one shape counted as sensible. I even sent a small wedding gift to the county seat, a jar of the same gooseberry preserves Constance had once brought to my own table, and received, in return, a stiffly polite note of thanks that told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly he had already filed the whole matter away. Jacob's memory sits easier in me now than it did those first 2 hard years, not because Owen replaced anything of what I had with him, but because Owen never once asked me to set that memory aside to make room for whatever we were building instead. He fixed the loose board on Jacob's old workbench in the barn without my asking, the same careful way he fixed everything, running his hand thoughtfully along the old wood grain before setting to work, rather than simply tearing it out and replacing it wholesale the way a less patient man might, and left it standing exactly where it had always stood, tools and all. A small, quiet acknowledgement that some rooms in a life stay occupied by more than one person at a time, and that the honest accounting of a heart, unlike the accounting of a ledger, never actually requires anyone to come out even. I catch myself some mornings still reaching automatically for 2 coffee cups before I have consciously registered why, a small habit that has outlasted every hard sum I ever did at that kitchen table. And I have come to think that habit says more about what actually held together, in the end, than any of the careful arithmetic either Bellamy or my own exhausted midnight worrying ever managed to produce. Owen still teases me sometimes about the exact wording of that first offer on his porch, claiming he has never once, in all the years since, tasted an egg that came with quite so much honest pride attached to it. And I still tell him every time that he is welcome to go back to buying his eggs from the mercantile if he finds the pride too seasoning for his taste. At exchange, we have repeated often enough by now that it has become its own small, comfortable tradition between us. She never told him what the eggs and honest work were really worth. She only kept setting a full plate at her table, long after any debt between them had been settled twice over. And some evenings, watching Owen work a piece of scrap leather by lamplight, or Constance's own grandchildren chase the barn cats around the newly mended barn, laughter carrying easily across the dooryard the way it once had when Jacob was still alive to make the same kind of noise, she thought that whatever the honest accounting of a life actually looked like, it had never once, in any ledger worth trusting, been reducible to a single column of numbers at all.